Hello everyone, this is Jason Baker and welcome to our hands-on video covering auto-scaling groups. Now we use auto-scaling groups to help support the scale-out pattern of computing, where we need to scale out a number of EC2 instances to support our application. We could create those EC2 instances manually, one at a time, but it's far easier to simply define a template describing what our EC2 instance should look like, and then use an auto-scaling group to create any number of EC2 instances using that template. This allows us to scale out a fleet of EC2 instances supporting our application very, very quickly. The auto-scaling group is also fairly smart in the sense that it recognizes if our EC2 instances fail, and if an EC2 instance fails, it will automatically replace it with a new one based upon the template that we defined. Additionally, the auto-scaling group can scale up the number of EC2 instances or scale down the number of instances based upon some sort of metric. For example, the auto-scaling group can monitor the average CPU utilization across the fleet of instances. And if the average CPU utilization increases beyond a certain threshold, then the auto-scaling group can automatically scale up and add more EC2 instances. The idea is that our application platform can dynamically expand, can dynamically scale up based upon demand, and then scale back down. You could imagine that this would be really useful, especially if your application, if your business experiences significant fluctuation in demand throughout the day, throughout the week. Okay, well, let's look and see how we create an auto-scaling group. Now, there are a couple different components involved in creating auto-scaling groups. First, you need to define an auto-scaling template, or what we call a launch template. The launch template is basically defining what we want the EC2 instances to look like. What are the properties, the configuration properties of the EC2 instances in the auto-scaling group? Once we have a launch template, then we can define an auto-scaling group. And the auto-scaling group basically defines where we want the EC2 instances to be launched. Like which VPC and subnets do we want to use to launch our EC2 instances. Now, before I start creating resources, I just want to point something out that's important. I'm already logged into the EC2 dashboard. If I scroll all the way to the bottom on the left-hand nav, you'll see an auto-scaling option where we can create auto-scaling resources. You can see we can create an auto-scaling group, and then there's something called a launch configuration. Now, we're not going to use the launch configuration. The launch configuration is very similar to a launch template, but it's essentially the older version of a launch template. That's how we used to create launch templates years and years ago. But we don't use launch configurations anymore. Today we use launch templates, and you'll find those under the instances section. So it's a little bit confusing because AWS is going through this transition period where they're gradually replacing the traditional auto-scaling group launch configuration with the new EC2 launch templates. And the names are very similar sounding, so students can oftentimes get confused when they see the two. But we want to use launch templates. Okay, well, let's get started. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start by creating a security group for that the EC2 instances in our auto-scaling group are going to use. So I go to the security group menu item on the left-hand nav, click on the Create Security Group button, and I'm going to give my security group a name. I'm just going to call it I'll call it the class-SG security group. And this is going to allow incoming HTTP access, so incoming web access. And for our VPC, I'm just using the default VPC for now. You can do the same, or you could really use almost any VPC that you want as long as it has multiple subnets. I'm going to add a rule, an inbound rule, and here I'll add a rule allowing HTTP on port 80, and the source is going to be the internet, 0.0.0.0/0. Okay, that looks good. And I'll go ahead and create that security group. Okay, the class-SG security group is created. Next, I'm going to go and create a launch template. So I click on the Launch Templates link and the Create Launch Template button. I give the launch template a name. Let's call it my class-template. And we can give it a description. If we want, I think that's optional. There's a checkbox here. It says provide guidance to help me set up a template that I can use with EC2 auto scaling. You can use launch templates with other services. If you're creating a launch template for EC2 auto scaling, then I recommend checking that box because AWS will give you some helpful guidance here when filling out this form. I scroll down to the launch template contents. Here we can define the Amazon machine image, the AMI that we want to use in our launch template. At this point, we're this is very similar in some ways to how we define an EC2 instance when we're launching an instance. We just like when we're launching an EC2 instance, when we're creating this template, we're defining what sort of EC2 instance we want an auto scaling group to launch for us. We'll click on the AMI drop down, and I'm going to select the very first one, Amazon Linux 2 AMI. And then under instance type, I will select the T2 micro instance type. Under key pair login, we'll just leave it at don't include in the launch template. We don't need a key pair since we're going to use the session manager service. Under network settings, we're launching this into a VPC. We don't define the VPC yet. That'll be defined when we create the auto scaling group. We can define the security group here, and we've already created a security group called class SG. So I will create that. I will select that security group. Scroll down. Under storage volumes, we'll just leave it at the default. Of course, we could add more volumes if we wanted to. Under network interfaces, we'll leave that empty. We'll select the advanced details. We'll look at some of the advanced details that we can set. We would like to specify an IAM instance profile, and we'll use SSM access for our IAM instance profile so that we can use the session manager to log into an instance created by the Autoscaling group. And there are a number of other advanced options that you can look at here, like enabling termination protection and modifying the tenancy model, a bunch of different things. We can specify user data here if we want to run a bootstrap shell script when the instance launches. We don't need to add anything here at this point. I'll go ahead and click on the Create Launch Template button, and that template has now been created. If I click on that Launch Templates link, you can see I have a launch template called the class template that's been created. Now, if I scroll down and go to the auto scaling section and click on the auto scaling groups, I can create an auto scaling group by clicking on the button on the right. I'll give my auto scaling group a name. I'll call it the class-ASG, stands for auto scaling group. For the launch template, I'll select the drop down and select the class template that I created earlier here in the video. You can see that some of the details of that template, that launch template that I defined, like the instance type, and you can see the AMI ID, the security groups associated with the template, and so on. I'll click on the next button, and I can, under the network section, I can define the VPC that I want to launch, that I want to launch the EC2 instances into. And I'm just using the default VPC here for this example. I can select the subnets drop down, and I'll select at least two of them, US East 1A and US East 1B. There's two different subnets and two different availability zones. That's a very common pattern when deploying instances using an autoscaling group. We'll generally deploy those instances across two or more availability zones. That looks good. Click on the next button. And next, I can configure the group size and the scaling policies. And this really gets to the heart of auto scaling groups and the functionality that they provide. I have really sort of two different ways that I can manage two different ways I can sort of define rules that the auto scaling group will use to manage the number of instances that it creates. I can define a group size where I specify a minimum capacity, a minimum number of EC2 instances that should be running at all times. I can define a maximum capacity, and then I can define a desired capacity, which would be whatever I want the sort of the current level to be. For minimum capacity, I'm going to do 0. For maximum, I will do 2. And for desired capacity, I'm going to do 2 here as well. What I'm saying is that the auto scaling group can run anywhere from no instances all the way up to 2 instances, but we want the auto scaling group, our desired capacity is to always run at least 2 instances. And this is a very common auto scaling configuration where we have a set number of EC2 instances we want to run at all times in our auto scaling group, and the auto scaling group is going to ensure that that number of instances is always running. Even if an instance were to fail, then the auto-scaling group will automatically will replace it, which we'll see here shortly. The other way that you can manage the number of EC2 instances in an auto-scaling group is by defining a scaling policy. If I click on the target tracking scaling policy, then I can use some sort of metric to scale up or scale down the number of instances that are running. And this is really more of an advanced configuration, and we don't use it in this class, but I want you to be aware that it exists, that the auto scaling group doesn't have to just run a static number of instances at all time. It can actually increase or decrease the number of instances that are running based upon some sort of metric that it is monitoring. Okay, so that configuration looks good. I'll click on next, and we could add notifications if there are scale up or scale down activities. We won't do that here. We'll click on next. We can add a tag, and here I'll add a tag. I'll add a name tag with a value of, I'll just call it class web. And that will tag new instances that are created by the auto scaling group. I'll click on next. I can review this configuration. I think all looks good. And I click on the create auto scaling group button. Okay, my auto scaling group has been created. If I click on the name, I look under instance management, and you can see that it's already spinning up 2 new instances. In fact, if I go over here on the left to click on the instances dashboard, there we go. We have 2 instances, 2 class web instances that are spinning up. Now, sometimes the auto scaling group doesn't immediately start spinning up the instances. It might take up to a minute for it to recognize that it needs to queue up these instances and begin launching them. And in this case, when I recorded the video, it was almost instantaneous. But your experience might be a little bit different. There might be a short delay before it begins to spin up these instances. But you can see the auto scaling group has already launched the instances. These instances are now running and available. Really cool feature. We can use auto scaling groups to automatically launch these instances for us and keep these instances running. Now, we have 2 instances currently running, and the auto scaling group is configured to automatically keep 2 instances running at all times. What if I come through here now and say, well, I want to terminate one of these instances. I want to simulate a failure. I'll select one of the instances and click on Terminate Instance and shut that instance down. Now, if I go back down to Auto Scaling Groups and click on the Class Auto Scaling Group, Instance Management, you'll see now that there are 2 instances, but it recognizes that one of the instances that it launched is now unhealthy. And it sees that it's unhealthy, and it's going to wait a little bit of time to see if that instance recovers. Now, if it doesn't, it will automatically spin up a new instance. We'll go back over here to the instances dashboard, and there we go. It's already begun spinning up a new instance. You see it's pending. And it'll be running here shortly. I'll switch back to the auto scaling group dashboard, look at instance management tab again. Here we go. We have 2 instances again. They're both healthy. The auto scaling group recognized that one of the instances failed and then automatically replaced it with a new one based upon that launch template that we defined. Really, really powerful feature. In fact, I use auto scaling groups all the time. In fact, it's pretty rare that I actually launch an EC2 instance that's not being maintained and managed by an auto scaling group. Even if it's just a single EC2 instance, I'll have auto scaling groups that only have one EC2 instance in the auto scaling group. And you might be asking yourself, well, why would you want to do that? Aren't auto scaling groups, designed for scaling out? They are, but they also are very helpful when you just want to run a single EC2 instance and you want to ensure that that instance, at least an instance of that type, is always running. You could imagine, like, if you had an EC2 instance and it was running some sort of important service, and for whatever reason you could only run it on a single EC2 instance, you could configure it to be managed by an auto scaling group. That way, if the instance were to ever fail, EC2 then would automatically replace that instance for you with a new one, even in the middle of the night. It's great because if you are on call, if you're going to get paged, if your service fails, then with an auto scaling group, you can build a service which is self-healing and can recover automatically from infrastructure failures. Really awesome capability. Now, if I go to the instance management tab, you can see that both of these instances are still healthy. We look at activity, the activity tab, you can see that our instances have scaled up and scaled down. You can see a history log of activity here. I'll go ahead and click on the details tab. And under group details, you can see the rule settings that we defined, the capacity settings for our auto scaling group. Remember, we said our desired capacity is 2. Now, what happens if I update that and say, no, I don't want my desired capacity to be 2. I want it to be 1. I click on update. If I go back to the instance management tab and I click on refresh, this might take a minute or so to update. Go back to the instances dashboard here. There we go. Now you can see that one of our class web instances is now shutting down. The auto scaling group recognizes that our desired capacity is 1 instance, and it is shutting down one of our existing instances to make sure that the number of running instances matches our desired capacity. And now that instance is gone. Fantastic. You might be wondering, why don't we actually see that terminated instance? Well, because I'm actually filtering the view. I'm filtering the view and removing any of the terminated instances from the view. Okay, well, we have this one remaining instance running, and what I want to do now is basically delete the auto scaling group. I'm going to go to remove this configuration. I'm going to go down to auto scaling groups, and I'm going to delete the auto scaling group. Click on delete. So I'm deleting the auto scaling group. And when I do that, it will delete the remaining instance that's managed by that auto scaling group. When you delete that auto scaling group, it will then delete the instances that it manages as well. Kind of cleans up after itself. I'll go back to the auto scaling groups. You can see that it's deleting. This might take a minute or so. When that's done deleting, then we can go to the launch templates menu on the left. And you can see our launch template. Now, if I try to delete this right now, let's see if it'll let me. The auto scaling group might not be done deleting yet. Oh, it'll let me delete it. Okay. The launch template is deleted. If I go back down to auto scaling groups, oh, the auto scaling group was deleted as well. So if that auto scaling group wasn't fully deleted yet and you tried to delete the launch template, then it might give you a warning message or error message saying that the launch template is currently in use. But I think the auto scaling group deleted before I deleted that launch template. If I go up to my instances list, you see that all the instances are now gone. And that's it. That's how to work with auto scaling groups. Create launch templates and then create the auto scaling group. One thing I didn't cover in this video, but it's something that you will do in the class as an exercise and as an assignment, is to create an elastic load balancer in combination with an auto scaling group. And that's a very, very common configuration. I almost always do that. And the two services are integrated very tightly together. And it makes sense, right? Because if you're going to create an auto scaling group and scale out a number of instances, it only makes sense to also create a load balancer that can distribute incoming requests to each of the instances in the auto scaling group. So it's really a perfect combination and one that we use quite often. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this auto scaling group video and that you're ready for the next hands-on segment. Thank you.